All right, Andrew, this is a little study guide. Andrew just took his CDL test and passed with flying colors. So he's just basically going to go through the list in the order that those things are listed that you're probably studying from. Some of these things may change for next year's test, but at least you'll be able to see the parts and kind of see how they're looking for you to speak to it. So yeah, this will be pretty informal.
This is as of the 2017 test. This is the sheet that Kelly sends out, and that's what we're going to be using. This is what I used to study for my test, and everything went fine there. First thing on your list is the front of the vehicle lights. We're actually going to do that one at the end of our outside inspection and start right in the engine compartment. So first thing's oil level. That's going to be on your passenger side. This is your dipstick for your oil right here, the yellow one. So what you'll do is you'll pull this out. And these are work shorts, so I'll just use the shorts.
I don't feel like you have to.
No, it's okay. I don't mind.
All right. See that dedication?
You know,
this is an instructional video on more than just the bus inspection.
Exactly. So you just wipe the dipstick clean, you put it back in, make sure it seats all the way, pull it back out, and check the level. You want to make sure it's above the line that says, or below the line that says full and above the line that says add. And for your test, for my test, the inspector didn't actually make me check all the oil levels or the transmission fluid. She actually just had me explain how to do it, just because it saves her a little bit of time. As long as you can explain it, that means you understand it. So again, that's oil. It's the first thing on there. And again, it says, you know, pull it out, look at it, make sure that's okay. Next one is coolant. The coolant reservoir is right up here. It's this big white reservoir over top of the fan and the radiator. If you can look on the side, I don't know if you can get in here, Mike, there's it's a line that says add, hitting that with the laser pointer, and one that says full. And you just need to make sure the coolant is somewhere in between. And you can check that just with your eyes. It says on the sheet, and it's super important, remember, don't open the top. Leave the top closed. You're just going to look at it. You know, it says observe the sight glass or line markings for proper level. Do not remove cap. Those are that's your sight glass, essentially. Next is your power steering fluid. That's this reservoir right here. Your dipstick is this. You're going to pull that out, wipe it clean, make sure it's above the add line and below the full line. It should be red. It's also important to emphasize that this is gear driven, and during your test you want to indicate, and I guess I'll show you with the laser pointer. You want to indicate, you know, here is your reservoir, and you're going to follow that line down here like this and back this way into the back of the engine, which should be, like I said, you'll follow this down here. If you see that laser,
yep,
and back here. And that's actually back in there. She's not going to have you touch it. You just need to indicate power steering is back here, and you need to say that it's gear driven. The way you can tell is there's no belts attached to it anywhere. The belts are connected to specific points that will indicate when we get on the other side. Actually, we'll do that right now. It's the water pump. So here's your belt. Your water pump is the lower of these two devices you can see here. This top one's the alternator. We'll get to that in a second. This lower one is your alternator. I mean, this one lower one's your water pump, sorry. Again, if you're checking any of these different reservoirs, different things like that, you want to check to make sure that there's nothing loose, bent, broken, or missing. You see the bolts on the side? This is all hardware. That stuff is in here tightly. You're looking for signs of rust, you're looking for things that are cracked, and then you're also going to check the belt tension. So to check your belt tension, you just wiggle it a little bit. Shouldn't wiggle more than between a ½ inch and an inch, otherwise it's too loose. And you're also going to look and observe just the condition of the belt. Is the belt, you know, frayed? Is it cut, cracked, chafed, dry rotted, anything like that? Just check the condition of your belt. You do need to say, this is the water pump, it's belt driven, because you have to indicate that it is driven by that belt there. Next is your alternator right here. And again, you're checking for that same thing. Missing bolts, nuts, or cotter pins. Nothing's loose, bent, or broken. I don't see any cracks. And because both of these components are made of metal, you're checking for what's called non-factory welds, which indicates that you took it to some body shop and they did a quick fix on it, and that actually won't pass a pre-trip inspection. So all of the things that we talk about, and I'll reiterate it as we go along, you're looking for things that are loose, bent, broken, or missing, and no non-factory welds. Because the alternator is an electrical component, you're also going to check to make sure that the wires at the back are secured there and there. And you're going to make sure that they're not loose, bent, broken, missing. They're not frayed. They don't see any signs of charring. And you make sure when you're over here, you don't smell that that there's been burning. You also need to identify that this is also belt driven. Again, that same green belt you see right there. So next up is our air compressor, which is on the other side. When I did my test, I started on the driver's side and did all of the engine components here that you need to identify, then move to the other side. You just pick whatever order works for you. You can go in this order, it just means a little bit of walking around. So here's your air compressor. That's this right here. So with your air compressor, you want to check to make sure that you have all of your bolts, nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. That's your hardware you're looking for. So you have all nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. Nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. You're also going to check the lines that come off of your air compressor, and you don't see anything that's frayed. Nothing's cut, cracked, or chafed, or dry rotted, and you don't see any missing hose clamp bolts, things like that. You need to identify whether this one is gear or belt driven. This is one that is gear driven, and I'll use the laser pointer. If you can look right there where I'm shining that light, that's actually the where the gear is housed to drive the air compressor, which is this whole unit right here. So again, you're looking at the conditions of the hoses and lines coming off of it, as well as making sure you've got all of your hardware. Next one just says leaks and hoses. For this, you just need to kind of feel around, demonstrate that you know where the hoses are, and what you're looking for is anything that's cut, cracked, chafed, dry rotted, anything that's showing any signs of leaking. Because this does have an air brake system, you need to say, hey, I'm listening to make sure I don't hear any sort of hissing, which could indicate an air brake system leak. You're also checking for spattered liquid, or, obviously if there's things coming off. And then you want to squat down, take a look underneath, and make sure you don't see any puddles or fluids dripping down underneath there. So it says, look under to make sure you don't see any leaks of any of your fluids, and also inspect all hoses. So all of your hoses from each of your components, you need to make sure that those are secured in place and they're not showing any signs of leaking. And again, you can check those when you're on the other side as well. We don't have hydraulic brakes. Next thing on your list, just skip it. Next, you're looking at your steering. So you've got your steering box and hoses. This is your steering box right here. All of this. So you're going to say, okay, well, check my steering box itself. I'm looking for, and nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. All of your nuts and bolts are in here tightly. You don't see any signs of cracks, dents, or non-factory welds, like we talked about before. You're also going to check to make sure you don't see any leakage. Because this is a reservoir, as in it holds fluid, you do need to make sure you say, I don't see any leakage. There's gaskets and things like that, which would indicate that it's full of, steering fluid. You're also going to check the conditions of these hoses, saying, I don't see that these hoses are torn, frayed, and they're securely attached to the steering box itself. This is your steering linkage. Runs up here. What you need to say about that is it's not loose, bent, broken, or missing hardware. There's nothing indicating that there's been non-factory welding, no cracks, no dents. It's properly lubricated. And then you need to identify the different parts of the steering system. That's your linkage right here. This is your steering box. This is called your pitman arm. This right here is the drag link. That is the tie rod end.
Stand by. Okay.
This right here is it's called a castle nut, and it's got a cotter pin in it. And as you're going through, you need to make sure you're saying, I have all of my nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. That will cover that'll cover this right here. Yeah, again, you're looking for nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing, no non-factory welds, and you have all of your nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. You can sort of use those word trains to help you a little bit. Next, we're looking at our suspension here. So first thing, it says springs and shocks. This is your shock absorber, then
just hold on one sec. I'm just shock absorber again.
This is your shock absorber right here.
Okay.
It's connected down at the bottom and up at the top with a nut that screws onto the big bolt that runs through the base. These are called leaf springs. It's a whole stack of them. They all work together. Legally, if you're missing more than a quarter of these, so if you've got 8 and more than 2 of them are broken or missing or bent, then you can't drive. All of our leaf springs are present and intact, which means we're good to go there. So those are your springs and your shocks. You're checking for missing, cracked, shifted, or bent springs. If more than a quarter are missing, your vehicle could be put out of service. So again, you're saying, hey, here's our springs. Nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. We have all of them. If we had more than a quarter, then we wouldn't. More than a quarter missing, we would not be allowed to drive. But everything's here and in place. No serious rust to be concerned with. For your shock, you're going to be checking for cracks, leaks, and missing bolts. So down there, that's one of your nuts. I don't know if you can see that where my finger is.
Yep.
And this bolt that runs through it, clearly that's in place. You've got nothing that's loose, bent, broken, or missing in terms of hardware. And additionally, there's another one right up here. I don't know if you can quite see that. It's right at the top of my hand.
Yep, I'm going to get there.
There's a bolt in there with a nut on the end. And for my test, she didn't actually have me indicate that upper one. I was laying underneath and I told her what I was seeing and she checked it off on the sheet. Next up, you've got what are called your spring mounts. So this is one of your spring mounts. This is the front spring mount for the front suspension. You'll have a front and a rear, which is basically where these giant leaf springs connect up here. And I don't know if you can see, there's one more back there. It looks exactly the same as that front one. And just for the sake of the video, I'm going to point out all the parts you need to say for each, but you do need to specify front and rear spring mounts and talk about them. So what you're looking for is, because it's made of metal, again, you're checking nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. You've got your hardware, which means nuts, bolts, and cotter pins, and you don't have any signs of non-factory welding or any cracks. You know, they're securely mounted to the frame of the bus, nothing to indicate that the spring would be loose or in danger of coming out, which would ruin your suspension. Again, you're going to need to go through that for both the front and the rear, but I'm just not going to crawl back there right now while we're doing this video. Next, you're looking for what are called U-bolts. These are these big bolts. They're actually shaped sort of like 3 sides of a rectangle, and they go down through here. You can see where my finger is.
Stand by, keep it there.
That's the bottom of your U-bolt. That's the nut. And you want to check to make sure the U-bolts are securely fastened to the vehicle. You're also checking to make sure that there's nothing that's loose, bent, or broken. And you're ensuring that the nuts, bolts, and cotter pins are in here tightly. Now, as I'm saying nuts, bolts, and cotter pins throughout this video, a lot of these things don't have cotter pins, but you just say them all together. That way, if there's a chance it does, you've already covered it. Save yourself a little bit of trouble. That's all we need for our suspension. Next, we're looking at our front air brakes. Now, this is a little bit tricky because you have some pretty precise parts. So your front air brake system is right here, this business. So, first thing you're looking at is your slack adjuster and your push rod. Now, this is important. The slack adjuster is made up of 2 components, here and here. The push rod is actually, I don't know if you can see, there's a rod that I'm touching right now. Right behind this piece, there's a rod.
Okay.
And that rod runs out. You can actually see it sticks through here. It's a threaded rod.
Got it.
And it connects to this. This is a big, long, C-shaped piece of metal. That whole unit, this part and the rod back here, is the push rod. The bits in between is the slack adjuster. That's a pretty important distinction you have to make. It's easy to get everything confused, but again, those 2 pieces are your slack adjuster. This piece and the rod behind it is your push rod. If you indicate any part on either of those 2 components, you're okay. So if you say, here's your slack adjuster, here's your push rod, you're good. You just have to make sure you cover each piece. Whether you cover all 4 or just 2 of them, as long as you're covering one for the slack adjuster, one for the push rod, you're going to be good. So you're going to check again to see nothing that's loose, bent, broken, or missing. You know, all of your hardware, which means nuts, bolts, and cotter pins, as an example. These are all in here. Your cotter pins don't need to be tight like a nut and bolt do. They just have to be all the way through and not, you know, broken, missing, bent, etc. So Slack adjuster should not be at more than a 90-degree angle with the brakes applied. We don't have the brakes applied right now because the bus is in neutral with the parking brake engaged, but you can say, when I apply the brake, the slack adjuster is not at more than a 90-degree angle, which would be unsafe. And when the brakes are released, which is right now because we have that emergency brake on, you say you can't be more than an inch of play. As you can see, there's really almost no play at all, which is good. If you have more than an inch, then it's unsafe and you can't drive. So that's the slack adjuster push rod. Next, you've got what's called a chamber. This is your chamber where all your air is held during your as you're using your air brakes. This fills up from the compressor. And again, because this is something that is it does hold in this case, air. You need to check to make sure that there's no signs of cracks, dents, nothing's loose, bent, broken, missing, no non-factory welds. And also you need to make sure you say, I'm listening for air leaks. You can't see an air leak, but you'll hear a hiss. So you say, right here, I'm listening to make sure I don't hear any air leaks coming out of there. This is your air hose. You're checking for loose connections. That's all in here secured, securely fastened at both ends. You're also going to check for nothing is cut, cracked, chafed, or dry rotted. I don't see any signs of dry rotting, or cutting, or cracking, or chafing. And then, like we said, the same thing, you're checking for air leaks. Obviously, any of your hoses or lines can't have holes in them. That goes along with cracks. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Next down is brake drum and linings. For this part, I'm actually going to get underneath to show you. So, like I said, we already mentioned hydraulic brakes are they're not on the vehicle, so you don't need to worry about that. We just went through our steering. Next, we're going to look at the front wheel section. So, first thing it has on here is the rims. So again, you're checking for, it says bend, cracks, and non-factory welds. So this is your rim here, and you're checking to make sure I don't see anything that's cracked. It even says no weld on it. So nothing is loose, bent, broken, missing. No serious rust to be concerned with. No cracks, and no non-factory welds. After that, you've got your hub seal. That's this right here. It's actually there's a gasket, you can't really see it in there, that's holding fluid in there. Because that has fluid inside of it, you need to check to make sure that it doesn't have any leakage. You're also checking for cracks, dents, and then nothing that's loose, bent, broken, or missing, no non-factory welds. So I'm checking each of these nuts here, each of those bolts there, to make sure. And this does not have a sight glass, so you can't actually eyeball where it is. Next, you're looking at the tire. So because this is a front tire, you need to check to make sure it has at least 4/32 of an inch of tread depth. You've got to say that. I usually just check it with my pinky, and that's plenty. That's more than 4/32 of an inch, which means we're okay. You're also going to check for cuts, bulges, or you're checking for cuts, bulges, and proper air pressure. So when you check the air pressure, she didn't have me actually do it. She had me explain it. What you do is you'd remove this cap here. It just twists off. And then you'll get your air pressure gauge, put it on there. And the proper PSI is right here. It's 110 PSI on the side of the tire. And you need to make sure you say, I'll check this to make sure it's at 110 PSI. You're also checking to make sure that there's, like I said, no bulges. The tire doesn't show signs of uneven wear, as in it's there's not sort of lumps, bumps, or serious worn spots. It's pretty uniformly worn across the top. And additionally, checked that it hasn't been retreaded. Because this is a front driving tire, it can't have been retreaded. Back tires are okay for that, but that shouldn't be an issue on this bus. Next up you've got lug nuts. 6 of them right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And for those, you're going to check to make sure nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. Like we said before. And also, if you see any rust, that can mean that there's a chance the bolt has grown loose and then rusted a little bit. You're going to check, say, no serious rust to be concerned with, nothing's loose. Again, that's the same sort of thing we talked about. Next up, we're going to do suspension. I usually
go.
So here you're looking at your brake drum and your brake drum lining. Your drum, I don't know if you can see, is the rusty, thick metal piece that I'm touching with my finger. Okay. This is the drum here. This is the brake drum lining. You look through any of these holes. What you're checking for is any sort of debris or any sign that it's worn dangerously thin. Again, that's sticking your finger in here and making sure you tell her that you're looking in there to see, there's no sticks, no rocks, etc. Your brake drum, the lower bit, you're checking that for signs of non-factory welds. Nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. And then again, you don't see any signs of serious rust or cracks or dents, etc. Same stuff like we're talking about for all of our metal components. At this point, I usually would take this time when I'm climbing under here to make sure I say, hey, I don't see any leaks underneath the bus. I don't see anything to indicate that the transmission fluid, oil, etc. are the reservoirs are leaking, because that's you make sure you got to say that one. That's important. At this point, yeah, we'll go ahead and step out again, go through the driver's area. Which next on your list, after we've gone through our brakes, again, we don't have to cover hydraulic brakes. Not something to be concerned with on this bus. This is an air brake bus. Next up on your list is the driver and fuel area. So you're checking the door, making it says cracked or bent hinges, and that it functions properly. So what that means is that you're showing that the door opens and closes appropriately. You're identifying along the hinges. Nothing's showing any signs of wear, no serious rust. All of my nuts, bolts, cotter pins are in place, indicating that the door is functioning appropriately. The glass, you can always add that in, because that's something you'll have to address anyway. I would say, glass is in good condition. None of our glass is missing. It's not cracked. It's not chipped, etc. While you're over here, it says talk about mirrors. So here's them over here. Mirrors they're talking about, this one here, this one here. What you're looking for is no signs of cracking. None of your mirrors are missing. They're all securely mounted to the bus with all of their nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. Additionally, there's no unauthorized stickers on the mirrors, and you need to make sure you say that they're both clean. So next we're going to check the fuel tank. Right here, you're going to open this up. Look inside, you can see your cap. And what you need to do is check to make sure the cap comes on and off. Making sure that has its threads. This one has a chain, so you can't drop it.
If take your hand out of there for a sec.
There you go.
I mean, crying out loud. I don't know that we need the shot of the cap, but now it's actually in focus. There we go.
But again, you're checking the cap. Make sure the cap comes on and off. And then when you're looking at that, at the fuel tank, you're going to look at the tank itself, which is actually right underneath here. Big rectangular reservoir. And what you're looking for with this, because it is a reservoir, it holds fluid, you're going to check to make sure you don't see any signs of leakage, specifically for the fuel tank. That's separate from your underbus leakage point that you made earlier. And you're going to check to make sure there's no cracks, no dents, no holes, nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing, no signs of non-factory welding. If you look right up here, and additionally right down here, there's a strap that actually holds the tank in place, runs over the top and connects on the other side. What you need to check for with the strap is if you see any signs of shiny metal, that would indicate that the strap has shifted from where it normally is. This will get covered in just grime and paint as you go along. But if the strap shifts, that means that you're going to see some shiny metal, which could indicate that the fuel tank is not properly mounted to the vehicle. It got loose over time, something like that.
And what we're talking about is this metal piece going across here.
Well, actually, what we're talking about is a strap. There's a strap that's connected to it. If you can see that, it goes over the top of the tank.
Got it. Stand by. I'm all over the place with the camera here. And so the metal strap on top. It's basically a giant rubber band. It's going to hold the fuel tank in place, and if it shifts, you'll see the color of the tank, which would be a bright shiny metal, because it's no longer covered up with the strap, and that indicates, hey, one of our straps is loose or broken or cut or something like that. And just to clarify, it's not rubber though; it's metal, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's what's causing the scraping.
Right. You don't need to know the consistency of the strap or anything like that. What you need to look for is the metal of the tank. That's what will be shiny. Copy. So, yeah. After this, we're gonna step back outside. Going down your sheet. Next up, you've got a section for cat. Go for it.
And catwalk and steps.
So your catwalk and steps, not something to be concerned with. I check the steps of the bus when I get on the bus, just because it's not going to hurt you to go through it. But that's on the back of the sheet, talking about interior stuff. So again, you can skip over that one. Lights and reflectors. I cover all my lights at the end because in my test experience, I asked her, would you like me to step outside and demonstrate each light's functionality? At that point, I was already in the bus, and she said, no, we'll step outside, we'll give you a thumbs up if it works, much like what you're doing when you're working in the lot with everybody else. So I cover the lights and the reflectors at the end when I sort of do my final walk around, if that makes any sense. So we'll come back to that one. Next is our under the vehicle section. Mike, you can come out around the back, and I'll go into the middle, make it a little easier. We're under the vehicle. Next, we're looking at the drive shaft. This is your drive shaft right here. It runs all the way from the front of the vehicle down here to the differential. And when you're looking at your drive shaft, you're looking for, again, no signs of, nothing is cracked, nothing's bent, loose, bent, broken, or missing, no non-factory welds. All of your nuts, bolts, and cotter pins are in place. And you can indicate that at any point along the drive shaft. I usually indicate that over here. You can see it by the differential because these bolts are pretty easy to access. You say, see, I've got all my nuts, bolts, and cotter pins in here. When I took my test, the lady didn't crawl underneath with us. She squatted next to the bus to make sure she could see where I was pointing. But she was not in here checking which nuts and bolts I pointed out, so long as I was pointing out some of them. The other thing you need to check when you're still on your drive shaft is proper lubrication. The way you look at that is you look down here and you see that the center of the drive shaft is well lubricated. I can spin that a little bit for you. It's not rattling around and it clearly has enough fluid. After your drive shaft is your exhaust system, and you're looking at this right here. For your exhaust, what you're checking for is, again, nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. No signs of non-factory weld. Additionally, with exhaust, you need to say, well, I don't see any holes. A hole could disqualify your bus. And serious rust. There's always going to be a little bit of rust on exhaust pipes. That's okay. You're looking for serious rust. That can indicate a serious issue. Additionally, because the exhaust is sending out, fumes, you need to check to make sure there's no sign of soot. If you see soot on here, that could indicate an exhaust leak, and that is something you need to mention in your test as well. What's next? Again, no signs of loose, bent, broken, or missing parts, nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. Next, we're going to look at the frame.
Okay.
This is your frame right here. That's a big piece of metal that runs all the way the length of the bus on this side, and there's also another one. I don't know if you can see that over here, but this is your frame. You only need to talk about it in one section. What you're looking for with the frame is nothing is loose, bent, broken, or missing. You've got all of your nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. No serious rust, no cracks, and no signs of non-factory welds. Again, it's important that you go through each of those points. Even though this doesn't have any sorts of hoses or belts, I will sometimes just throw in there the whole cut, cracked, chafed, dry rotted, even if it's not applicable, because you won't lose points and it doesn't hurt you to be extra thorough.
And if you missed it earlier, you got it now.
Exactly. At this point, we're going to step out and go over the wheels, the rear wheels, before we get back over here to do suspension. Here we're looking at our rear wheels. That's what's next on our sheet. And it's the same sort of inspection that you were doing on the front. What you're checking is tread depth. For the rear tires, it can't be less than 2/32 of an inch, which is plenty. This is plenty deep enough. These are totally fine for that in the major grooves. Additionally, you're going to check the space between the dual tires, making sure that there's no signs that they're touching. There's no signs of debris. There's nothing indicating that the tires are improperly spaced. You're looking at, we do have spacers on this bus. So if you look in here at your spacer, it's a gray disc. What you're looking for on your spacer, that it's not, there's nothing loose, bent, broken, or missing. There's no cracks, and there's no non-factory welds. It's your spacers right in here.
Got it.
At this point, let's go ahead and go through your rear suspension. All right, so then, okay, this is the rear suspension, and this is going to be the same as your front suspension. So the first thing we'll look at is our spring mounts. This is your front spring mount right here. There's another one at the rear. And what you're checking for, again, is nothing is loose, bent, broken, or missing. You've got your nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. No signs of non-factory welding. Nothing's cracked. etc. It's the same procedure we just went through for that first section of the front suspension. Again, you're looking, like I said, you're looking for cracks, and you're going to keep that same sequence of information, but when you're looking at your leaf springs themselves, that's these guys here. That's your lowest leaf spring, and then the rest of them. Like we said in the first one, you have to have at least 3/4 present. You can't have more than 1/4 that's bent, broken, or missing. Otherwise, you will fail your pre-trip inspection and you can't drive the bus. Again, with these, we don't see anything that's loose, bent, broken, or missing. Nothing's cracked. Nothing is showing any signs of non-factory welding, and no serious rust. As well as no missing nuts, bolts, or cotter pins for the leaf springs themselves. Additionally, if you can see back in there is the U-bolts. They look exactly the same as they do on the front set of leaf springs, but it's, again, you're looking at the same things. You're going to say, well, I'm looking at the U-bolts. I'm not missing any nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. Nothing is loose, bent, broken, or missing, or cracks. No rust, no non-factory welds. We do have a question that you'll have to go ahead and we'll do a bit of discussion about that. There's a section in there on the rear suspension that says inspect walker beams, torsion or torque bars, airbags, and airbag mounts the same if equipped. That'll be something we'll discuss later.
Yeah, make a note to get an answer on that one when you're reviewing this. Yep. Awesome.
That's what we're looking at for rear suspension.
Here you go.
Looking at your rear brake system, this is an air brake system. It's just like the front one. You'll need to indicate the same points, and you'll need to go through at the same depth. Your sheet just says, inspect this area the same as the front of the vehicle. What that means is, here's your air brake chamber. You talk about that's not cracked, it's not dented, nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing, no non-factory welds, and you're listening for any signs of air leaks. Here's your hoses coming off your air brake chamber. You're going to check to make sure those are
One more
securely.
time.
These are your hoses.
Gotcha.
You're going to check to make sure these are securely fastened at this end. They're not missing any of their hardware. There's no signs of cut, cracked, or chafed areas of the hoses. No holes, no dry rotting, etc. If you look over here, this is an easier way that you can see your push rod. This is the same push rod you have in the front. Again, that runs like this and it has a big C-shaped metal component here.
Gotcha.
Which runs around the slack adjuster. Those are your two components for the slack adjuster.
Yep.
This is your push rod, and that's the literal rod right there. So it's a little easier to visualize if you're looking at it back here. Again, that's the push rod, and this is the slack adjuster.
Got it.
So you'll need to talk about that. Make sure it's got its nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. Nothing's loose, bent, broken, or missing. No non-factory welds. Nothing's cracked, and no serious rust to be concerned with. Additionally, because we're talking about brakes, we need to talk about the brake drum and the brake drum lining. This is the same as what we had before. When you're looking at your lining, you're looking through this hole here inside, and you're saying, I don't see that it's worn dangerously thin. I don't see any debris, rocks, sticks, etc. blocking the brakes from functioning on the inside of the brake drum. Brake drum, again, is this thick metal piece. You're also checking to make sure you don't see any leaks, oil, etc. And you can check that if you want to be extra specific. You point right here. There's a set of bolts on an inner disc, and if you can put your finger in here and say, yeah, I don't see any signs of leakage. That's another great way to get make sure you're covering all your bases with that. Saying that you don't see any leaking coming from around here, which is the center of the brake drum. At this point, we're going to step outside and go over the rear of the vehicle.
Got it. And just since we're here, these are the U-bolts on the leaf springs. He was talking about that come through.
Oh, one other thing that we also mentioned. Just while we're back here, this one, I didn't lose any points when I forgot to mention it, but I would recommend, there's no harm in saying it, mention your rear shock absorber. That's something you should say. I think I got lucky because she didn't take off any points. This is your shock absorber. You've got your bolts and your nuts. Nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. Nothing is loose, bent, broken, or missing. No signs of cracking, denting, or non-factory welds. It's securely fastened. Nothing is leaking out of it. Again, this is your shock absorber. Those are your leaf springs. You can see the rear spring mount over there. It looks the exact same as the front spring mount. so you can study that same way as you studied the front.
Awesome.
This is your rear door. It's checking it the same way as you checked your side door. So you're going to check to make sure the hinges have all their nuts and bolts. You don't see any signs of serious rust. You check the functionality of the door, demonstrate that it latches, open it up all the way, and close it again. I always take the time to talk about the glass while we're back here. That's not on the sheet, but it's always worthwhile to bring up the glass, same like we did on that other door, because you can't be too careful about that sort of thing. We're going to go back over here and talk about the splash guard. This is your splash guard, also called a mud flap. And what you're checking for this is that you don't see any signs that it's fraying, dry rotted, cracked, chafed, cut, anything like that. You're checking to make sure it's securely mounted to the vehicle. There are small nuts and bolts that hold it in place up at the top. And you're again making sure it's not ripped or torn. That's the mud flap, splash guard. And then last thing you're going to check are your rear lights. So this is crucial that you actually go through these, because for me, the tester and her assistant came out and gave me the go-ahead. Hey, they work, but it's easy to forget if you're just waiting for them to give you the functionality test, that you didn't take the time to identify it, and you can lose points for that. So you've got to go through each of your lights and reflectors. It's the same on the other side. You only need to go. I only had to go through it on one side, and then I said, "Would you like me to demonstrate it again on the other side?" She said, "No, that's okay." She will give you more specific directions about repetitive parts. If you're checking. If you're checking mud flaps, or if you're checking brake system, suspension, always ask her, would you like me to demonstrate this procedure for the other side? And if you demonstrate it correctly on one side, she'll tell you that's okay or no. It doesn't hurt if you want to go around. It just doubles the length of your pre-trip inspection. So when we're looking at your back lights, this is your emergency flasher and turn signal. It's the appropriate color. There's some C's. You can remember this because it's the right color. It's clear, it's not cracked, and it doesn't show any signs of condensation. Those are your 4 C's you gotta remember. So it's clear, it's not cracked, it's the right color, no signs of condensation. You're also checking to make sure it has all of its screws. And you need to tell her, it has all of its hardware, in this case screws, securely mounting it to the frame. This is one of your tail lights. It's activated with the brake, and also when your headlights are on. It brightens when the brakes are applied. Again, you're saying the same thing. It's not cracked, it's the appropriate color, it's no condensation, and it's clear. So, once again, review that it has all of its hardware in place, screws, etc. This is another tail light. When you're on the other side, that's also used to identify the license plate. You'll go through this, again, same thing. Color, clear, no condensation, not cracked. This is your reverse light. This one is supposed to be white. It's the appropriate color, it's clear, no condensation, no cracks. It has both of its screws. This is one of your rear reflectors. For this one you say it's not cracked, it's the appropriate color, and it has its one screw holding it in place. There's actually another reflector right over here inside of the bus. You need to indicate that one as well. And reflectors up at the front, but we'll go over that towards the end. So we've been over the rear lights. Now we're going to move to the side and the front. I do this one last because it gives me a chance to walk around one last time. So if we come up here, so we just went over our rear lights. Up here we're going to look, this is called a side marker light. And again, it's the same procedure, those 4 C's. It's not cracked, it's clear, there's no condensation, it's the appropriate color, and it has its screws holding it in place. This is operated with your turning signal and your emergency flashers. We got to check up here in the front. Here's one of your other turning signal and emergency flasher lights. As you can see, it's clear, it's not cracked, no condensation, and it's the appropriate color. It also has all of its hardware, in this case screws, securely fastening it to the bus. Down here's another turning signal, same thing, 4 C's. It's clear, it's not cracked, there's no condensation, and it's the appropriate color, and it's mounted on here as well with its screws. This is your headlight. You're checking again, clear, no condensation, it's not cracked, it's the appropriate color.
Are we calling this color amber or
I just said yellow.
Okay.
So I said yellow, white, and red.
Copy.
And that was
Yep.
good for my test. That's your headlight. You'll have to test it with high and low beams, but again, we'll do that at the end with the inspector. While you're up here, go over your mirrors. And again, you don't need to check this on both sides unless she specifically says, I'd like you to do it again. One last thing we can go through again, those word tracks that we talked about. If you've got something made of metal, you're checking for nothing is loose, bent, broken, or missing. There's no cracks, no serious rust, and no non-factory welds. That's your anything made of metal, whether it's a component like the frame or something as simple as a piece of the suspension. If you've got any sort of reservoir, coolant, power steering, oil, transmission fluid, and the air brake chambers themselves, you're checking for leaks, and you're checking to make sure those reservoirs or chambers aren't dented, they're not cracked, and they don't show any signs of serious rust. You know, if you're making sure there's no leak, then that's the crucial component of that. For your soft components, hoses, belts, and electrical or hoses and belts, I guess, your best thing to remember is it's not cut, cracked, chafed, or dry rotted. That'll cover all of your bases for soft components. And then for electrical wires, which you only need to cover coming off of the alternator, you need to make sure they're not bent. You need to make sure that you need to make sure they're securely fastened to the component. You got to smell. Make sure you actually smell to make sure you can tell, hey, they're not burned. I don't see any signs of charring. There's not a loose connections, no fraying, etc. We're gonna go into the inside of the bus now, do the internal inspection, and then I'll demonstrate how to do the external inspection for lights at the very end. At this point, we're flipped over to the back of your sheet. We're inside the bus. First thing on there is your safety belt. So you're going to check to make sure the safety belt itself is properly secured and mounted. It's not torn, it's not ripped, it's not frayed. The belt is in good condition, and you need to make sure the latch functions properly. So I clicked it in place, and I'll check to make sure that's good. The next thing you do is called a safe start. You have to make sure you say, at this point, I'm going to perform a safe start. What that means is that the bus is in neutral. You don't have your foot on the air brake or on the gas, and the parking brake is pulled out, which means it's engaged. Like I said, it's called a safe start. Parking brake is applied or engaged. Vehicle is in neutral. And then you start the vehicle.
Go ahead and kill it. And the vehicle would be on, but for sake of being able to hear, we'll have it off.
So again, vehicle's running at this point. Next thing you're going to go over are your gauges. First thing is the condition of the gauges themselves. So what you say is, the glass or plastic lenses, it's not cracked. There's nothing obscuring my vision of what I need to see, which is the contents of the gauge. They're clean, no condensation. You can use the 4 C's, but you don't have to. You just need to say that it's clean and it's not cracked, nothing blocking your vision. So, temperature gauge is right down here. And once the bus is running, that should come up slowly. And what you say is, yeah, it's warming up right now. We're still cool, which is good. No signs of overheating. After that one, you've got your air pressure gauge. This is really important. That one's down on this side. And you see those 2 needles are above 90. What that means is that 90 is your safe driving range. If you are below 90, you can't drive. But what you say is, this is my air pressure gauge. I've got above 90, which means I'm okay to drive, and as you run, that air compressor will build up more pressure, and you'll actually hear it automatically cut off right around 120 psi, a big hiss, and then you'll hear sort of a secondary motor start up when it turns back on again, which is I think right around 110. It'll run in that range over and over again. But again, that's your air pressure gauge right here. Next is your oil pressure gauge. That's over on this side. And again, you're looking oil pressure when it's running. It'll be right around the middle, and you'll say, "Oh, this looks good." No indication that I've got too much or too little in terms of oil pressure. After that, we don't have an ammeter. We have a voltmeter. When you turn this on, it's going to probably sit right around the middle, and that's right around 13 or 14 volts, and that's perfect for driving. You just need to say, it's in a good operating range. Because this does have a gauge and it does not have a warning light, you use the gauge. It says that on your sheet. Your lighting indicators. What that means is, for your turning signals there, and your emergency flashers, both of those will flash. And your high beam indicator is actually, it looks sort of like a triangle with some lines coming off of it. It's right above your speedometer. You can go ahead and, I went ahead and identified this is my speedometer and this is my tachometer. But you don't have to do that according to your sheet. It's not going to hurt you if you do. So at this point, when the bus is running, you're going to check your various signals. I took this opportunity and asked my inspector, if you'd like, I can step outside and check the functionality of my lights at this point, or if you don't mind, would you be willing to stand out and indicate to me that all my lights are functioning? And she said, yes. But I had to tell her I would do it, and then I had to ask her if she would do it. So what you're doing for that is, you're sitting in the seat, you turn your right side turning signal on, it's flashing in here, it's good to go. You check out there, she'll be in the front, and she'll give you a thumbs up, return it to neutral. Turn on your left turning signal, same procedure. It's working in here, you're checking out there with her, she said it's good, you're good. After that, turn on your four-way flashers. That's a small hazard pull right here on the side of the steering wheel, sort of the steering wheel hub. It'll flash both of your turning signals together. You look out there, she'll give you a thumbs up, you're good, you turn that off. Then you'll turn your headlights on. Your headlights are operated with a knob down here. So turn them on, you pull that out all the way. You should click twice. You're not going to have an internal indicator of your headlights, but you do have an internal indicator for high beams. So headlights are on, should give you a thumbs up. Now if you can see down in there, there's a button right above my foot to indicate your high beams, or to turn your high beams on. You push your foot on that button and just, it'll make a nice loud mechanical click, and that's your indicator that your high beams are running. That little blue icon. Again, that's operated with a foot button, and she'll be out there to give you a thumbs up if you ask her, and if you tell her that you're willing to do it, but for convenience sake, she'll be out there to give you thumbs up and stuff. At this point, she'll go around to the back of the bus. She may start at the back, then do the front. You go through all of those again. When she's in the back of the bus, keeping your bus with the emergency brake engaged, put the bus into reverse so she can check the condition of the reverse lights, and also put your bus back in neutral and just depress the brakes once so that she knows the brake lights are working. It doesn't matter which order she goes in, you just need to make sure that you've covered all of those lights in the front and the rear of the bus. Next up, your horn, pretty straightforward. Sounds fine. Your heater and your defrost. This is when you move over to this panel right here. Your defrost is the furthest switch in the bottom row. You just turn that on. We'll put the accessory on. That's your defrost. Those are your heaters. And for these, what you're saying is, they function properly. Over here, these are, you can run those if you want. Little fans. If you feel like that's something you'd want to go ahead and cover, there's no harm in that. These are your defoggers for your mirrors. Turn those on when you get in the bus. Tell her that you've turned them on. Tell her that they work. Then you've got your wipers. Your washer is in the middle here, and I'm just going to press that and hold it. And it's dispensed washer fluid. You've got two wipers, one for each side. They've got a low speed and a high speed. So you do yourself a favor and wash your windshield, and then wipe it and say, look, my wipers work, my washers work, etc. One thing we should talk about while we're in here is you're looking at your mirrors and your windshield from the inside of the bus. So I'm looking through my windshield. I don't see that it's cracked. It's clean. It's clear. There's no chips, and there's no unauthorized stickers. What that means is that you've got your inspection sticker, and you can have an auto care sticker, repair sticker, oil change, something like that. But you can't have, coexist or peace and love or whatever on your windshield. Additionally, while you're in here, you need to check the adjustment and the condition of your mirrors. So we already talked about the mirrors on that side. She probably won't have you come around and identify them again, but you say, yep, here's my convex mirror, the big bulbous one. Here's my rear view side mirror. Again, they're both clean, they're both clear, they're not cracked, and there's no stickers obscuring my vision. Up there in the front, different names for them by different folks. Some call them antenna mirrors, some call them cat eyes. I just use those when I'm looking at the road. I don't really have a special name for it. Again, you're checking. I said my mirrors down here and indicated to them. They're clear, they're clean, they're not cracked. Then you've got your internal rear view mirror here. This one you have to say, it's clean, it's clear, I can see out the back of the bus, it's not cracked, there's nothing obscuring my vision like a sticker, etc. We've already went over the windshield, it's your same thing as you had with your windows. making sure they're not cracked, making sure they're not chipped, no stickers, etc. We've been through our wipers and washers. I did those two out of order just because we're already at the panel. So the next three components is the parking brake, service brake, ABS, and air brake tests. You have to do those absolutely last. Don't do those until the very, very end. You don't have a hydraulic brake, you can skip that. Next, you have your safety and emergency equipment. What that means is that you've got a fire extinguisher here. This is mounted and properly charged. It's not expired, so it's in case of an emergency, that's ready to be used. Additionally, if you look up here in the what would be the glove box, that's your set of spare fuses. That plastic right there. Those are your spare fuses. And then lastly, in here, this is a box where you've got your 3 highway safety triangles. You got to make sure that you say they're in there, and those will actually come up in your driving test as well. Making sure you're talking about those. Next, it says, if passenger vehicle also inspect. You're getting your passenger endorsement for your commercial driver's license, so you do have to inspect the following things. Passenger entry. Mike, if you point the camera down right here, what you're talking about there is that the door opens and closes properly. As we talked about before, when we were outside the bus, the door latches in place. You're also going to check to make sure that the steps and the handrail are secure. They're not missing any of their hardware, nuts, bolts, cotter pins, or in this case, screws. They have all of their components securely fastened in place. You also are checking to make sure that the steps are not indicating any signs of worn treading, which would be something that's worn slick and is dangerous for folks to move in and out of the bus. Additionally, we're going to check our seating. So Mike, you can come stand right here, make it a little easier. Okay. So for your seating, you need to walk all the way through the bus, and you need to indicate that all of your seats are secure and in place. They're not missing any of their hardware, nuts and bolts, etc. Everything is in here tightly. So I walk my way through the back. In that instance, like it said, secure with no missing hardware. It says on your sheet. Normally, like I said, the bus would be running at this point, and since the bus would be running, when I open this door, there'd be a big loud buzzer, and you need to make sure that buzzer operates. You can offer. I offered in mine to check the emergency roof exit. She said for me, you didn't have to do it. She may ask you to do it, so be prepared for that as well. These exits vent for airflow, and they also open out in case of an emergency. You need to get out that way. Our bus does not have a baggage compartment, so you don't need to talk about that. Because this is not being inspected as a school bus, you don't need to go over student lights. You don't need to go over student safety items. So you can skip those two parts of the school bus inspection. One last thing that you can talk about, that for mine, it wasn't on this sheet, and she said it was, thank you for covering it, is internal lights. There's a switch up here at the front. You flip that on, and it'll light up these lights here inside the bus. Again, it won't cause you any problems to point it out. So turning that light on up at the front is another important part of the internal inspection. At this point, you should have covered everything that's on your sheet. For me, when I had really gotten mine drilled down, I didn't need any papers or notes. It would take me about 25 to 35 minutes to go through the whole thing. They'll give you an hour. Use as much time as you need to. I was super redundant, pointed out parts over and over again. It's not going to hurt you. They're not going to take off points because you said it 2 times or 3 times. It's a great way to make sure you've covered everything. The last test we're going to do are our brakes test, which will be back at the front of the bus.
3, 2, 1. Air brakes.
So we got those 3 brake tests that we talked about before. You need to do them in a specific order because one of them requires movement and that one needs to come last. When you first get to the inspection site, chalk your wheels. They should stay chalked the whole time you do your external inspection. You don't need to take them off for your internal inspection, but you will need to have them on specifically for 2 of these 3 tests. So your first test is your parking brake test. Our parking brake is still engaged, it's pulled out. What I'm going to do is put the bus into a low gear, so I put it down in 1, and then I'll give the bus some gas, and I can feel the bus struggle against the brake, and that's what you need to say. You say, I can feel the vehicle pulling against the brake, but the vehicle does not move. That's the parking brake test. It's very straightforward. Then you put your bus back in neutral. At this point, we're going to do our air brake test. For this one, we need to start off by making sure our gauge is above 100 psi. So right now we're at about 120, which is perfect. So then we're going to cut the engine.
Watch your hat there. You lean back.
Okay. Then we'll put the accessory on. You can tell because of that buzzer. And we're going to take off the parking brake. At this point, you press hard on the foot brake and you hold it in place. You're going to hold it here. For me, it's all the way down. You're going to hold it here for 60 seconds, and you're going to monitor where we started. So 90, 100, the next about 103, 104, something like that. That's what you're watching for. You're saying, okay, I'm right around 104 or 105 psi, and you hold this here for a minute. You know, she's not going to say anything. You're going to sit in silence, and after a minute, she'll say, okay, it's been 1 minute, and you say, well, we didn't lose any of our pressure, which is good. If you lose more than 3 psi, you're out of business, your bus can't drive. So you got to demonstrate, yes, our air brakes are functional and they're not leaking. After that, once you've held it for a minute, you're going to turn the key to the on position where it is right now, and then you're going to pump the air pressure down. What that means is my parking brake is off, my bus is in neutral, my foot is all the way down because we did our 1 minute hold, and now I'm going to take my foot on and off. That second buzzer comes on right around 60, and that you need to say, hey, you know, we've got a warning light and buzzer coming on at 60. That pop you just heard is the automatic parking brake engagement. That will come on right around 40 psi, and it says that on your sheet. As you can see, we're right about 40. You can still hear that second buzzer. That indicates to you that you're below 60, and then the parking brake comes on at 40. You make sure you say those numbers. People will tell you different things. I went with what was on the sheet, and she told me that was right. Use 40 and 60. That's all for our air brake test. Once you're set right here, you go ahead and turn the bus back on, let the air pressure build back up to above 90 so that you can move the bus for the service brake test, which is your last test on the brake section of the bus. Your last test is your service brake test. It's very straightforward. You'll practice this in the parking lot a lot. But what you're doing is you'll put the bus into drive, you'll pull forward till you're going 5 miles an hour, then you'll apply the air brake with your hands off the steering wheel. If the steering wheel pitches hard to one side, that indicates you've got unequal braking pressure. It shouldn't do that. And what you need to say is, as you can see, my steering wheel didn't shift too much, which indicates I've got even braking.